All right, welcome everyone. I think we're waiting for a few more folks to click in. Just give it about 20 seconds. All right, thanks so much for joining the second Clinicians Connect call. Really appreciate everyone's interest. Again, we welcome feedback on this. This is something that we're trying to shape with our clinical community on the go. So if there are topics you'd like to hear about, ways you'd like to see this done differently, send the feedback. We would really welcome it. All right, I think we have some slides, yeah? Great. So generally about the Clinicians Connect series, the purpose is to make sure that we have a clinically focused conversation with healthcare providers. It has been an opportunity to get multiple federal agencies on the line so that you're not just hearing from the FDA, you're also hearing from our federal partners, because some of these priority topics, we really work in close concert with our federal partners. So today's webinar, prime example of that, we're going to talk about the current state of the opioid crisis, have some excellent experts from across the federal government who are joining us. Thanks so much to them. We're going to focus on what federal agencies can do and healthcare providers as our partners to prevent drug overdoses and reduce deaths from the crisis. Next slide. Experts on the call. So we have Josh Rising from the FDA, who is a senior clinical advisor to the Commissioner for Mental Health and Substance Abuse. Marta Sokolowska, who's the Deputy Center Director for the Center for Drugs for Substance Abuse and Behavioral Health. Captain Chris Jones, who comes to us from SAMHSA. He's the Director of the Center for Substance Abuse Prevention. Dr. Wilson Compton, who is from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. Will talk to us about some of the research aspects. And Dr. Laura Sessoms, who's the Chief Physician for the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. Next slide. I'm not going to spend too long on this. In the resources that we're going to share at the end of this session, the HHS overdose prevention strategy is certainly one of the key ones to look at. Tries to organize the various efforts from across HHS into these 4 buckets. So primary prevention, harm reduction, evidence-based treatment, and recovery support. You're going to hear about updates in each of these areas. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Josh Rising to give an overview of the state of the epidemic right now. Thanks.
Super. Thank you so much, Dr. Marston. Start with just some facts and figures that many on the call may be familiar with, but just to level set and make sure we're all on the same page. This graph, which was taken from the website from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, shows the steady increase in overdose deaths in the United States over the past 20 years. Couple of items I'd like to highlight from this graph in particular. The first is the growing gap between male and female overdose deaths, especially over the past decade. And then the second thing I'd like to highlight is the significant increase in overdose deaths that occurred during the COVID public health emergency, where we went from slightly over 70,000 overdose deaths in 2019 to over 90,000 overdose deaths in 2020. Next slide, please. This graph shows the involvement of various drugs in overdose deaths during the same time period. If you could advance one, so this is a zoom in to see in particular what's been happening in recent years. So most notably, of course, is the rise in fentanyl-involved deaths that started around 2015, and the more recent rise in deaths involving stimulants, specifically methamphetamine and cocaine, which are the yellow and orange lines there, respectively. Note that deaths involving heroin have decreased in recent years. One thing that isn't really captured on this slide, but is really important when understanding what's happening with the overdose epidemic, is that most overdose deaths do involve multiple drugs. According to data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, in 2022, 82% of deaths involved at least one opioid, and additionally, 57% involved at least one stimulant. Next slide. I do want to conclude the figures and graphs section of the talk on a bit of a positive note. As this slide shows the most recent data on overdose deaths and provides hope that we may be turning the corner, at least on the number of overdose deaths. In 2023, deaths are estimated to decrease for the first time since 2018, and thus far the trend appears to be continuing in 2024, which is clearly very welcome news. Next slide. Clinicians have an important role across the 4 pillars of overdose prevention that Dr. Marston brought up earlier. And examples in each of the 4 different categories are given here, what clinicians can be doing in their own practice. I will, of course, want to highlight the recent removal of the so-called X waiver at the federal level, which was needed for providers to prescribe buprenorphine. There is still a requirement for an 8-hour training, and providers do need to make sure that they are in compliance with state laws, but the removal of this barrier was a step forward in improving access to buprenorphine. Next slide. I want to close by just talking about stigma briefly. And like other members of society, stigma can be present among clinicians, and clinicians need to be sure that stigma isn't affecting the care that they're providing to their patients. One survey of primary care physicians, which was published in 2021, did find that clinicians generally agreed that opioid use disorder is a chronic condition, such as diabetes, and clinicians also believe that people with opioid use disorder can, with treatment, get well and return to productive lives. On the flip side, however, less than a third of clinicians expressed a willingness to have someone taking a medication for opioid use disorder as a neighbor, and even fewer were willing to have someone who is taking a medication for opioid use disorder marry into their family. That concludes what I wanted to go over. I'm happy at this point in time to turn the mic over to Dr. Marta Sokolowska, and she's the Deputy Center Director for Substance Use and Behavioral Health within the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. Over to you, Marta.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And just leveraging of what we have heard from the previous 2 presenters, I would like to present you with a brief overview of some of the work that CEDAR have been doing to address the overdose crisis, not only the opioid, but also broader overdose prevention efforts that we have been engaging in. If we can move to the next slide. These are my disclaimers and conflict of interest statement. Next slide. Thank you. So as mentioned by Dr. Marston earlier, in 2021, HHS issued a revised overdose prevention strategy that FDA looked at and identified specific overdose prevention priorities and that we wanted to focus on that are based solely within our authorities and best methods for FDA to help to support the overdose prevention activities across the government and supporting our stakeholders. So within that, we aligned the first 3 priorities directly with the HHS overdose prevention framework, and we wanted to focus on primary prevention, specifically focusing on eliminating unnecessary initial prescription drug exposure and inappropriate prolonged prescribing. For the second priority within harm reduction, we really wanted to focus on innovation and education, particularly related to overdose reversal agents, utilization and development. As a third priority, we wanted to focus on substance use disorder treatment, especially development of novel treatments, as we understand that there is a great need. And there are a number of substance use disorder treatments that do not have currently FDA-approved treatments, such as stimulant use disorder treatment. And the last one, the last fourth priority is focusing on FDA role to regulate drug supply, and specifically focuses on protecting the public from unapproved, diverted, or counterfeit drugs presenting overdose risks. So with that, I would like to take you through some of the activities that FDA has been working on for each of these the priorities within the last year. If we could go to the next slide. So regarding primary prevention, within the last year, we had a number of actions. I wanted to focus today on the two specific actions. One is regarding our new safety label update for the opioid pain medications, and the second one regarding our efforts on increasing disposal of unused medication. So specifically regarding our label updates, we required the manufacturers to update the prescribing information for both immediate release and extended release long-acting opioid pain medicines. And that includes stating for all opioid pain medication that the risk of overdose increases as the dose increases. And with that, for the updates for IR opioids or immediate release opioids, state that these products should not be used for an extended period of time unless the pain remains severe enough to require them, and alternative treatments continue to be inadequate. Furthermore, we state that for many acute pain conditions treated in the outpatient setting require no more than a few days of an opioid pain medicine. And this may include pain occurring with a number of surgical conditions, musculoskeletal injuries. We also updating the approved use of extended release and long-acting opioid pain medicines to recommend that they be reserved for severe and persistent pain that require an extended treatment period with a daily opioid pain medicine, and for which, again, alternative treatment options are inadequate. And in addition, we also asked to add a new warning about opioid-induced hyperalgesia for both extended release as well as immediate release opioid pain medicines. Regarding the disposal efforts, we announced in April of last year that FDA is requiring the manufacturers of opioid analgesic dispensed in outpatient setting to make prepaid mail-back envelopes available to outpatient pharmacies and other dispensaries as an additional opioid analgesic disposal option for patients. Again, leveraging from the information that we have, despite all the efforts to decrease, to assure that we have appropriate prescribing of opioid pain medication, we know that based on the recently reviewed data, that there are still a number of pills that remain in medicinal cabinets. And we want to make sure that patients have a lot of options to dispense them or dispose of them in a safe manner and a quick and efficient and convenient manner. And we are working with the manufacturers right now on implementation of this additional disposal, mail-back disposal options through RAMs. While at the same time, we are also exploring other at-home disposal options for the appropriateness to be included as part of the increased access to disposal, medicine disposal solutions. Next slide, please. Regarding harm reduction, as I mentioned, we are predominantly focusing our efforts on increasing access to overdose reversal agents. One action that I wanted to highlight is that in March of last year, we approved first branded over-the-counter naloxone nasal spray. So at current time, we have both prescription and over-the-counter overdose reversal agents, which we are really hoping it's going to help with increasing access to this life-saving medication. However, we didn't stop with approving of the first product. We have since that time, we approved a number of both generic as well as branded over-the-counter nasal spray products. We also approved other overdose reversal agents such as nalmefene nasal spray, that is a prescription product. Also understanding some of the concerns that were expressed to us from stakeholders regarding shelf life of overdose reversal agents. We worked with a sponsor to review available information regarding the shelf life and stability of these products. And we're thrilled to announce that extension of Narcan nasal spray products shelf life from 3 to 4 years, and that was in January of this year. Next slide. Again, understanding that there is a great need to increase access to evidence-based treatments for substance use disorders. We've been putting a lot of efforts into better understanding how the currently approved substance use disorder treatment are being utilized, if there are opportunities that we could take to better understand the medical need to broaden the access. So we've done a number of initiatives to understand how opioid use disorder treatment, such as buprenorphine, is being utilized, what are some of the barriers to initiation or maintenance, or what are some of the factors that it can use to facilitate it. And we had a number of sessions across the different stakeholders, including our tribal listening sessions in that regard. We also worked on approval for generic naltrexone product that is both for extended release injectable for both opioid use disorder and alcohol use disorder. We also recently launched a campaign to encourage primary care providers to prescribe MOD or medication for opioid use disorders. Next slide, please. And having said that, we, as I mentioned, we have our fourth pillar is protecting the public, where we recognize how the drug supply is changing. And whenever we hear that there are some concerning information, we are trying to better evaluate it and communicate it to our stakeholders. So for instance, understanding the xylazine exposure has been quite prevalent recently in the illicit drug supply. We hosted a public meeting on mitigating risks from human xylazine exposure. Again, xylazine is a veterinary product. It's not approved for human use, and we know that, but we know that it is in illicit drug supply. We also warn consumers regarding purchasing or consuming thionectin products, as particularly the Neptune fix products. We also are trying to better understand kratom, that we know that a lot of stakeholders are using, or patients or persons within the US are using kratom products. We want to better understand some of the safety and abuse potential components. Thus, we support research in this space. And so we understanding that a lot of controlled substances are being purchased online. We've been co-hosting meetings to address a better understand availability of these controlled substances online, especially when it's illicit, and to better understand the demand for these products. So with that, if we can move to the next slide. So the next steps, so we continue working on addressing the 4 pillars, as I described, focusing on primary prevention, broadening access to overdose reversal agents. For instance, we understand that there is need for more work to better understand the optimal dosing for different population, for different needs and preferences of the patients. We also work on expanding therapy options for opioid use disorders, as well as for other substance use disorders, understanding that, again, we need to put more efforts into development of stimulant use disorder treatments, for instance. We also focusing on developing additional surveillance on potentially targeting illicit or unapproved counterfeit products, and we monitor new substances that can pose a threat to public health. So with that, we can move to the next slide, but I believe, thank you, and I'm looking forward to questions and the discussion.
Fantastic. Marta, thank you so much. I think next, Chris, I see you coming on camera. So Captain Jones, please.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you to Dr. Marston for having us here for the conversation today. It's good to be with everybody. I'm Chris Jones. I'm the director at the Center for Substance Abuse Prevention at SAMHSA. Next slide. And I'm going to talk really just about our harm reduction and overdose prevention work. Obviously, SAMHSA's mandate is broad across the behavioral health space, and we have lots of activities going on, both upstream and downstream, to address the substance use and mental health challenges America is struggling with now. But as Josh and others said, I think it's important to contextualize the challenge that we're facing as we think about overdose prevention and the fact that we are dealing with a dynamic, evolving illicit drug supply that has never been riskier. But we're also seeing patterns of use that are changing, and that also impacts how we think about our harm reduction and overdose prevention work. In particular, the continued introduction of substances like xylazine, other adulterants in the illicit drug supply, increasing co-use of substances, other synthetic substances that are showing up in the illicit drug supply. And then most recently, CDC noted a shift in routes of use among people who are dying, where injection had been the most common route among overdose decedents, switching to smoking. And as we think about harm reduction in particular, we have syringe services programs around the country, but historically those have been linked to people who inject drugs. And so there is a need to make sure that we are educating individuals that regardless of what route of substance you use, including if you're smoking, there are life-saving interventions like opioid overdose reversal medications, xylazine test strips, fentanyl test strips, low barrier treatment, access to infectious disease testing and screening and linkages to care that can be provided by community-based harm reduction programs like syringe services programs. Next slide. And at SAMHSA, again, we're working across the behavioral health space, and in particular in the Center for Substance Abuse Prevention. Our efforts focus on preventing the initiation of substance use, preventing the progression of substance use, and preventing and reducing substance use related harms. And we do this in concert with our Center for Substance Abuse Treatment, which focuses on expanding access to treatment, recovery support services, as well as looking across harm reduction and overdose prevention. Next slide. I wanted to just highlight two specific tools that we have put out in the last year at SAMHSA. The first is our harm reduction framework, and this QR code will take you to the document. But it was the first document from HHS to comprehensively outline and define harm reduction. And it was really 2 years of work that started in 2021, engaging with external individuals across the behavioral health continuum, in particular people who have been doing harm reduction work in communities for many, many years, to inform SAMHSA's definition of harm reduction, to inform a set of best practices, principles, pillars, and strategies that can really be applied across the behavioral health continuum. Next slide. So I wanted to highlight the pillars and principles of the harm reduction framework because we recognize that some people may view harm reduction simply as interventions, things like opioid overdose reversal medications or syringe services. But harm reduction is also an approach, how we engage with individuals who are using drugs or people with lived and living experience. And we felt that that was important to spell out. And, regardless of where your practice setting is, you can embed and embrace principles and pillars into your clinical settings. So the pillars are sort of broader about engagement with individuals who use drugs. So thinking about how are we engaging and letting individuals who use drugs and those with lived experience lead the work in harm reduction. How are we embracing inherent values and dignity, empathy, and respect for individuals? Thinking about, again, being very community ground up in our efforts, promoting equity, rights, and reparative social justice, offering the most accessible and non-coercive support, so treatment and other services without conditions, and then focusing on any positive change, recognizing that our ultimate goal with harm reduction is to help empower individuals on a healthier path. Even if that change is small, it's still positive change. And then the principles really, again, are, I think, sort of core practices about how we show up and engage as clinicians with people who are in front of us seeking services and care from us as clinicians. So autonomy, acceptance, hospitality, providing support, connection. Again, other principles, I won't go through all of these in the interest of time. But again, you can see how these could be integrated and applied across clinical practice settings. Next slide. And then core practice areas. And again, some of this certainly goes well beyond the clinical space, but it does, I think, provide opportunities to think about, as individuals who are operating in clinical spaces, in health system spaces, how are we also engaging in the community and with the community to make sure that comprehensive holistic services can be provided with the lowest barriers, the fewest barriers possible. And so we look at really 6 specific practice areas: safer practices, so educating individuals on how to reduce risk and the provision of supplies and services to reduce risk. Thinking about safer settings, safe environments to live, practice safer use and receive supports that are trauma-informed and stigma-free. Safer access to healthcare. Obviously, as Josh mentioned, stigma is pervasive among the clinical community. And many individuals who've used drugs often say they don't want to engage with the health system because of how they've been treated in the past. So how do we help embrace a shift in the clinical sphere so that individuals are welcomed and not stigmatized and want to seek and engage in person-centered services? Safer transitions to care, again, thinking about how does the health system connect with other parts of the continuum to ensure that people are able to get the services that they need. Continuing to focus on a sustainable workforce and field. This is not unique to behavioral health, but we certainly know in the health field, there are many gaps in the sustainable workforce. And of course, thinking about the sustainable infrastructure, recognizing that harm reduction has often not been funded through federal and state resources. And so how are we, again, working across sectors to ensure that these life-saving services are available in communities? Next slide. And then the last toolkit that I wanted to mention was our overdose prevention and response toolkit, which we released earlier this year. And this is really intended to reflect the latest overdose trends, recognizing that we are not just in an opioid overdose environment, but really a polysubstance overdose environment with contaminants in the illicit drug supply as well. But we wanted this to be a very practical toolkit, really having very specific practical tips for preventing, recognizing, and responding to an overdose, and then providing information on the variety of opioid overdose reversal medications that are available. As Marta said, a lot of new products have come on the market or different formulations of older products in recent years. The toolkit, again, is intended to be more practical tips. It includes information for 5 different audiences. And I'll just note there's a specific section for practitioners and health systems. Next slide. And in the document, again, we tried to make information accessible, more bullets than text. And you can see here we include a table that talks about the different formulations that were available at the time of the publication of this toolkit. And then we also provide sort of practical tips and strategies for reducing risk by different audiences. So if you're an individual who's using illicit substances, what are strategies that you can take to reduce risk? And again, this could be quite useful for clinicians to have that conversation with patients. We also have a separate section for people who are receiving prescription opioids for pain care, because strategies and risk are different than individuals who might be using illicit substances. Next slide. And as I mentioned, we include a section in the toolkit specifically for healthcare providers. And again, sort of bulleted actions where healthcare providers can engage in non-judgmental, empathetic care, can not only provide things like life-saving opioid overdose reversal medications, but use that touch point with the patient to think about assessing needs for substance use disorder, other co-occurring disorders, providing medications for opioid use disorder, other life-saving supports, recognizing that any touch point with the health system is a critical opportunity to understand what's going on with somebody and connect them or provide life-saving care. Next slide. So again, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I look forward to answering any questions. I know that was very quick, but you can find both of those resources on the SAMHSA website. And I will now turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Compton.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jones. And I too am so glad to be here today to participate in this interagency discussion that really represents an all-of-government approach to addressing the overdose crisis in the U.S. I represent the National Institute on Drug Abuse, so I'm very pleased to very briefly talk about some principles of how we're approaching research to address this crisis. After all, our research program spans many, many different domains, everything from molecules to managed care in terms of the topics that we may cover in our program. So in about 8 minutes, I can only cover a couple of things today. Next slide. As Dr. Jones, those are my disclosures, nothing related to today. Next slide. As Dr. Jones highlighted, we've had a major change in the substance use landscape. And I think that's one of the issues for our field, is that this is a dynamic situation where there are markets that change. There are purveyors of these products, whether that's the licit providers in terms of the pharmaceutical industry with the prescription opioids over the last decades, or the illicit markets, a shift from agricultural products, heroin coming from the opium poppy, to the synthetic drugs like fentanyl, methamphetamine, and numerous other agents that are on the horizon. Next slide. We've all been surprised by the emergence and spread of an animal tranquilizer, xylazine, that has now been seen in almost all of the major opioid markets across the country. Really a bit of a surprise, and produces some unusual effects in terms of skin lesions in people that seem to use this chronically. Also, this isn't always detected, so people may come in with unexpected complications or greater sedation than expected, and it could be due to exposure to this new agent. That's just a couple of examples of how the marketplace is changing and the drug use landscape is shifting in front of us, and how we need to be agile and able to respond to these changes. At the same time, research doesn't happen instantaneously. And so as we develop a research portfolio, we need to pick the major themes and systematically approach and address those. Next slide. I think of this in terms of sort of two major themes. Of course, a major part of our portfolio and our work is, how do we take all this new knowledge about the brain and the central nervous system and develop new treatments? How can we understand the receptors that are involved in opioids or tobacco or other substances, and develop new treatments to address the addiction to these substances or the misuse or the harms caused by these substances? That's a key part of our program. Next slide. I think of this, and I've just highlighted for you some of our major efforts in terms of new treatments for opioid use disorder and overdose, whether these are the early studies in terms of basic neuroscience or clinical studies, as well as new formulations of existing medications. For instance, Dr. Sokolowska mentioned the approval of a new formulation of buprenorphine. Well, some of that work was supported by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and that's typical for many of the agents that are produced and released for clinicians to prescribe, that they may come from programs that were supported by our researchers that are funded by NIDA. Next slide. Of course, it's not just opioids, but as the landscape has changed, we've had a major effort to try to develop medications for stimulant use disorders, methamphetamine and/or cocaine. And while this is not as robust, you just notice there aren't as many agents being tested, but there are some very promising agents being tested along the way. Although I will say, you notice there's sort of a shift a little bit to earlier phase. We really need some help and some breakthroughs to make sure that we get to the later stages of development when they can be released to the public for prescription. Next slide. All right, that is a rapid review of some of the medication development, but one of our exciting areas is in the device space, where we see brain stimulation techniques, whether that's the transcranial magnetic stimulation, deep brain stimulation, or direct current stimulation, as ways to change the brain circuits that are involved in the decision-making and the appetites that underlie the use of substances. And it turns out that these may be effective in treating substance use disorder. For instance, we already see the brain stimulation devices, the transcranial magnetic stimulation, cleared by FDA's Device Center for the treatment of tobacco use disorder. Well, might some of these same pathways be important for cocaine use disorder or opioid use disorder? That's a very important question that researchers are working to address right now. One of the latest techniques would be focused ultrasound. So instead of just magnets, that we also may be able to use ultrasound to change and modify brain circuits deep within the central nervous system. Very exciting opportunities, both for our field and broader within neuroscience. Next slide. All right, I've highlighted in a couple of minutes how we might go from basic science discovery to the development of medications that can be used to treat patients. But simply because we've proven something can be used doesn't mean that it will be widely available. So how do we make sure that our work is ready for translation into field settings? Does it have financial coverage? Can you obtain the treatments in the local service delivery systems? These are the kind of questions that the services research and the implementation science can help us address. Next slide. I just want to highlight a couple of major programs that we're very pleased that because of congressional appropriations under the Helping End Addiction long-term program over the last 5 years, we've been able to launch major programs to bring treatments into clinical settings. That's our clinical trials network that are looking at things like higher doses of buprenorphine. Might those be useful for persons who are using fentanyl, this extraordinarily potent opioid? Can we develop new ways to bring these medications into emergency room settings? That's been a major theme for our clinical trials network over the last 2 years, thanks to this additional support from Congress. The second major program will be our Justice Community Opioid Innovation Network that is looking to bring treatments to many people that need them that are involved in the criminal justice system. So whether those are people who are arrested related to drug use or drug-related behaviors, whether people who are incarcerated, either in jails or in prisons. In many parts of the country, medications for opioid use disorder are not available in jails and prisons. And yet, when people are released, they are at extraordinarily high risk for overdose. So this group has been working with probation officers, with judges, with sheriffs, with jails and prisons to come up with practical solutions to changing these major service delivery systems and bringing these life-saving treatments to such a large group of persons in need of this care. Next slide. I just want to wrap up by reminding us that it isn't just implementing new practices, but sometimes we need to stop less effective practices. So there's one study that I highlight for you of testing a clinical decision support tool for not using opioids as much following dental extractions. This is a notorious place where clinicians have been essentially over-prescribing opioids, in many cases where they're not necessary. But yet changing that practice isn't so easy. So this is an example of how much it takes work to stop doing something that isn't effective as well. Next slide. I'm going to wrap up by just reminding us about our small business program that also supports the development of commercial enterprises to be part of this innovation, that sometimes the small businesses can do things that none of the rest of us can do. Next slide. And finally, our director at NIDA, Dr. Nora Volkov, has been emphasizing that it's important that we think about not just focusing on the ultimate full recovery and full abstinence from all substances, but think about how we help people make those steps along the way and make meaningful improvements in their lives that can lead to major improvements in health and in individual health and in population health. That we make sure that we don't focus on just these sometimes unachievable ultimate goals, and make sure that we focus on achievable goals in that process of trying to change behavior and improve the population health. Next slide. I hope I've highlighted for you that the National Institute on Drug Abuse is working as hard as we can to conduct research at multiple levels of this overdose crisis, both to bring new treatments, new approaches, as well as implementation strategies to make sure that these treatments that are shown to be effective reach the populations that need them. And with that, I'm very pleased to turn it over to the next speaker, who is Dr. Sessoms.
Thanks so much, Dr. Compton, and thank you. I'm delighted to join you today and appreciate the opportunity from Dr. Marston to tell you a little bit about our clinical resources. Next slide, please. For those of you who don't know much about AHRQ, I want to tell you that we are an agency within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and like our sister agencies pictured here, we produce data and research evidence. We also produce tools and strategies to improve the delivery of healthcare. Our mission is to improve the lives of patients by helping healthcare systems and professionals deliver care that is high quality, high value, and safe. However, AHRQ is not a regulatory agency, so we are here to help, but not to mandate. Next slide, please. We do have a strong focus on primary care, and in 2010, AHRQ created the Academy for Integrating Behavioral Health and Primary Care, or the Integration Academy, as a national resource center for the developing field of behavioral health integration into primary care. And over the ensuing 15 years, primary care behavioral health integration has been recognized as a linchpin in the diagnosis and treatment of behavioral health conditions, including substance use disorder, even as those conditions become more prevalent. Our Integration Academy works to meet the growing demand for useful and usable information to support behavioral health integration. The Integration Academy website has a lot to offer, including a curated library of tools and resources, a calendar of webinars and trainings, a newsletter and a listserv, and then a searchable database with thousands of articles and other evidence. Next slide, please. I want to share with you some of the Integration Academy resources specific to substance use disorder, medication-assisted treatment for opioid use disorder, and the prevention of opioid overdose deaths. So the medication-assisted treatment for opioid use disorder playbook is a web-based step-by-step guide that walks primary care practices through the process of making the treatment a regular part of their practice. Each step includes goal setting, key considerations, and links to specific resources for help. For those who are just looking for specific resources, say opioid use disorder screening tools, patient handouts, staff training materials, etc., the Substance Use Tools and Resources Database is a searchable database originally composed of those tools and resources developed by AHRQ research grantees and then updated by regular searches of published and gray literature. Next slide, please. And lastly, just a few more specific resources. The Opioids in Older Adults Compendium was developed through working with learning communities of primary care practices who were trying to improve how they managed opioids in older adults, with a goal of simultaneously controlling pain and reducing the risks of opioid use. Both adverse events and opioid use disorder. The compendium describes 9 areas of high leverage change where practices can improve and includes both an assessment to help identify where to start and links to tools and resources to help practices implement those changes. And finally, we have the role of low threshold treatment for patients with opioid use disorder in primary care. And this is a brief that makes the case for primary care to provide low threshold buprenorphine and describes how to get started. And we know this is important as we've just seen data on how there are not enough people that prescribe buprenorphine and some of the problems with the primary care perception of persons who have a use disorder. But we hope these and other resources on the Integration Academy website will be helpful for you. And now back to Dr. Marston.
Thank you so much. We just got a whirlwind of material, so that's wonderful. I can't actually turn my camera back on, so if somebody's able to help me with that, that would be great. So we're going to turn it over to questions. Thanks for those who submitted them in advance or submitted them in the chat. So I'm going to start with SAMHSA. So Captain Jones, you're going to be on the spot here. There's been a decrease in buprenorphine prescribing since the revocation of the X waiver. What else can be done?
Yeah, this is a great question and something that we've been tracking over the last several years very closely within HHS because of the variety of regulatory changes, both during COVID as well as with the removal of the X waiver. And I think the latest research that's been coming out is not necessarily showing a decrease per se, but sort of a slowing of the increase. There's been a sort of consistent upward trend in the number of people, depending on data sets that you're looking at, getting buprenorphine, but certainly not an increase in the slope or an expectation that we would have sort of relieved some of the regulatory pressures that you would then see an outsized increase in prescribing. And I think it underscores that this is a complex issue. We have done research over the last several years to ask questions why people don't prescribe buprenorphine of a variety of different providers. And we continue to see that there are other barriers within the system that certainly serve as challenges for people engaging in care. And some of that, as Josh mentioned earlier, could be stigma. We see that people don't want to manage patients who have opioid use disorder. We see that there are issues around reimbursement and payment. There's issues of self-efficacy among providers and feeling supported. If they run into trouble, what's their backstop? Who can they work with? And, expert specialists to help navigate how to manage those patients. And I think from a very individual level perspective, there's an opportunity to continue to increase education among clinicians. SAMHSA has a providers clinical support system, which is a system to provide training to individuals specific to OUD, to MOUD, to address some of those concerns about how do I do this? How do I do this in the right way? What we find is that oftentimes once people start engaging in the practice of prescribing buprenorphine, they actually find it quite rewarding because it's one of those few places in medicine where you can see a really dramatic shift in your patient in a very short period of time. So I think there are a lot of myths, and we can continue to use education and training to address those myths, while also looking at some of the systemic and systems barriers around payment, connection to psychosocial services, backstop with specialists, and looking at models that have been put forward like hub and spoke and other models that really try to take a holistic perspective to make sure that clinicians have the support that they need in order to navigate patients. But we really need to be addressing all of those barriers. There's no single driver of why people aren't prescribing. And if we don't look at it in a comprehensive way, we'll continue to see incremental progress.
Thank you so much. Okay, Dr. Sokolowska, and then to Dr. Compton, how can FDA and NIH help to facilitate development of non-opioid pain medications?
So maybe I'll start. And we've been working very closely with our NIH colleagues on helping to address this issue. But from a FDA perspective, I think it's really three-pronged approach. One is we recognize that it's a great unmet need, and we've been working on it and discussing it now for a number of years. And because of the unmet medical need, we want to make sure that there is opportunity to utilize the expedited programs that have been recognized, and we have guidance documents on that. So with unmet medical need, there is an opportunity for fast track designation, for priority review, for breakthrough therapy designation, depending on the current status of these programs. And we really want to make sure that the companies, the sponsors, are really utilize these programs as appropriate. As the second prong, I would want to emphasize our work on trying to help to facilitate these drug development programs by issuing guidances. So, for instance, we issued a draft guidance document on development of non-opioid analgesics for acute pain. It was done in 2022. We look forward to reviewing all the comments that have been submitted for that program and to issue the final guidance. And we also have already announced that we are working on development of draft guidance for development of a non-opioid analgesic for chronic pain. Again, understanding that this is a big area of need and that needs to be addressed. And the third prong is working with our sister agencies such as NIH and NIDA on development of these new products. And as you've heard from Dr. Compton in this presentation, we have a number of products that are currently under development, and we are so thrilled that we see progress in that. But to speak more to that, I invite Dr. Compton.
Thank you very much. Certainly, we can highlight both the development of new medications in the pain space that are non-opioids. For instance, I'm very intrigued by some of the basic science work on the sodium channels related to peripheral pain transmission. There's some really remarkable examples of small groups of people that don't have pain receptors, that don't seem to experience pain the way most of us do. And so that discovery of that genetic variant helped us understand the importance of these peripheral pain receptors and are leading to new medications that are currently under development and may prove to be very useful in reducing the experience of pain by stopping it where it starts, at our periphery, when you have an injury, for example. A key example of this, though, is where we need to partner with FDA to make sure that as the studies are being conducted, that they're done in a way that can lead to product approval. Because I have a lot of academic colleagues who want to study something, but they may not do it in the way that will allow a medication to be approved. So that's been one of our challenges and one of our goals, is to make sure that we link our researchers early in their process of medication development with FDA so that the data can be used towards approval of these medications at the end of the process. I'd also point out that we have medications that aren't opioids that are good for a lot of pain conditions. And so a lot of what we've seen in the last decade has been the surgery community coming up with opioid sparing techniques as part of post-op care. And it's been really remarkable to see the medical community coming up with novel approaches. You know, the easy example is ibuprofen and acetaminophen following third molar extraction. When kids have their wisdom teeth removed, they rarely need opioids. And yet opioids are often prescribed. Well, we've had data for decades now to show that there are effective treatments in that condition. That for many, not all, because there's still many times when we need opioids, but it should be a lot less frequent than has been the case.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that. So we have a couple of questions here that are generally just factual about care for opioid use disorder. So first one is, can you explain the role of tachyphylaxis in treatment? And then another one about just resources to understand the appropriate length of treatment. So Captain Jones, I'm going to turn that one over to you. Where can people find more information? And if you have any comment on the tachyphylaxis question, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, certainly we know that both acute and longer-term tolerance have an important role to play when we think about opioid use disorder and use of opioids, whether it's for pain care or treatment of opioid use disorder with agonist-based treatment. SAMHSA does have a variety of resources to educate clinicians on these issues and the management of opioid use disorder. I would refer you to our TIP 63, which is our latest on medications for opioid use disorder. It's pretty comprehensive, looking at the various medications that are available. I think the current clinical practice is that there's no end date when you're using medications, and I think that that's an important piece. I mean, some of it is, you know, person dependent on what's going on with the person, how are they doing, what are their motivations, what are their interests, and in some cases, somebody might not want to be on a medication for the rest of their life. And that's a decision to make between the clinician and the patient, understanding what's happening, what supports and services that they have, what's going on in their recovery. And then other individuals, totally appropriate clinically to maintain an individual in ongoing care. In fact, we see many patients on methadone or buprenorphine for many, many years doing quite well. And so again, I think that is, historically the payment side of the house has put arbitrary dates on when people should be done with treatment. And I think the beauty of integrating medications into general medical settings is that we don't have those same arbitrary limits, nor should we have those same limits.
Great, thank you. And Dr. Sessoms, did you want to chime in also?
Yeah, I think I would just say that on our Integration Academy website for primary care practices who are trying to figure out how to navigate some of these questions, we do have resources, and both in our playbooks and then the compendium involving older adults, as well as searchable databases. So some of these questions for people live on the ground trying to do this work are on the Integration Academy website. Thanks.
Thank you.
I would just want to point out, Dr. Marston, that this is a major question for research. And so we would love to have a test that said, patient Jones in my clinic needs to be on it for a lifetime. Patient Smith could be stopped after 3 months or 6 months. We don't have that ability at the current time, but that's a major research question that might be based on people's background and history. That's what many of the clinicians have already observed. That depending on the length of time they've had a substance use disorder, depending on comorbidities and the other complications that are part and parcel of taking care of these patients.
That's such a good point. So how can we translate that spidey sense into something that's actually evidence-based? Appreciate that. All right, Dr. Sokolowska, coming back to you on the opioid REMS, thoughts on its utility as a risk mitigation tool? Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for the question. And to address the overdose crisis or the opioid crisis, I think it's really important that we facilitate education and we really use numerous tools in our toolbox. So the opioid REMS and the focus on education to date is really just one of the components of a much broader system and matrix of tools that we are hoping that will be utilized by the clinicians and prescribers to better understand whatever options for pain management and how to best treat patients, and also have better information and more up-to-date information regarding disposal, for instance. And that leads to the second component that I wanted to mention, and what I've mentioned earlier in my presentation, is that our approach right now to incorporate also disposal as part of opioid RAMs. Question regarding is the wrong mitigation approach. I think this is one of the mitigation approaches to the overdose crisis. And if there are any specific comments, we are looking forward to hearing from everyone. But I don't think it's one and all. We really want to see it. We see it as one of many tools in broader toolbox. And I think that it still has a place.
Wonderful. Thank you. And last question, and then we'll wrap up. I'm going to start with Captain Jones, but if others want to chime in, please do. What do you think is the most impactful intervention in terms of minimizing the number of opioid overdose deaths? Thanks.
If only it were that simple to a single intervention. I mean, I think the recent projected 10% decline year over year from CDC provisional data has really prompted people to say, what's driving this? And I think there are a variety of hypotheses on why that is. But I will say certainly naloxone and nalmefene and other opioid overdose reversal medications are acutely life-saving. We see massive expansion and use of those products in communities, and there's no doubt that that is having a positive impact. And we continue to see the life-saving value of medications for opioid use disorder, even in the fentanyl era. We did a paper, some of us on this screen wrote a paper looking at people who had a non-fatal overdose and their risk for dying of a fatal overdose in the 12 months following that non-fatal overdose. People who got methadone, their odds of fatal overdose in that 12 months was reduced by over 50%. It was about 50% for buprenorphine, and that's during the COVID fentanyl period. And I think we have to continue to underscore that those drugs work, that they're life-saving, but not nearly enough people have access to them.
Thank you very much for that. Okay, so wrapping up, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Again, please submit topics. We're deciding on the next topic as we speak. We are going to make available the slides that have been presented and the various toolkits, resources that have been mentioned. They'll be on the FDA Clinicians Connect website, linking to the appropriate sites, and along with the recording of this. It'll just take a little while to process them, make sure that they're compliant with all of our rules for federal government websites. And with that, Stacy, did I miss anything?
Hi there, you didn't miss anything. We're also going to be putting our mailbox in the chat if you have any topic suggestions and/or questions for the next call.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much for joining.
Thanks very much.